My name is Dilys Martin, and I am 29 years old. Every Thanksgiving, my parents sat at the head of a mahogany table and called me the dumb one. They did this while toasting my sister Chloe for her Harvard degrees and promising her the keys to the family timber empire. On the day she graduated, my father stood in front of 300 guests and announced she would inherit everything, including a new Tesla and a $17 million mountain mansion. I was sitting in the back near the kitchen, just listening, until a stranger in a tailored suit walked in, handed me a wax-sealed envelope, and whispered that it was time to show them who I really was. I did not scream. I did not throw a fit. I just quietly read the document that gave me legal control of a $58 million holding company. Welcome to Cue Those Told Stories, where the people pushed into the shadows are usually the ones holding the blueprint. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, tell me your age in the comments, and let me know I am not alone. Now let us go back to the night the ledger started to balance. The snow off the Bitterroot Range drove hard against the dining room windows of the Martin estate. We live in Idaho, where the winters are brutal, and the people pride themselves on a rugged, self-reliant lifestyle. Inside the house, the heat radiated from a River Rock fireplace, smelling of roasted sage and expensive bourbon. I sat near the foot of the long table, tracing the wood grain with my thumbnail. According to the people seated around me, I was the most enduring disappointment in the room. Richard, my father, did not look at my sister as he spoke. He looked at his guests, 2 local politicians and a developer from Boise, ensuring they were paying attention to his favorite subject. You know, Senator, when Chloe passed her final exams, the dean personally called me, top 2% of her class. Chloe offered a practiced, modest smile, tilting her head just enough so the chandelier light caught her pristine hair. "Dad, please," she said. "It was just a lot of late nights in the library." "Nonsense. It is genetics." Richard raised his crystal glass. I watched his lips move. I have an auditory processing delay. When multiple people speak or when a room fills with the clatter of silverware, the sounds hit my brain like radio static. I have to manually untangle the syllables, finding the meaning a fraction of a second after everyone else. As a child, that meant I answered questions slowly. To my father, a man who measured worth by rapid-fire boardroom dominance, my processing speed meant only one thing. I was slow. The label stuck. My mother, Susan, reached across the table to adjust a floral arrangement that needed no adjusting. "Well, we are blessed," she chimed in, her voice carrying an artificial warmth. Both our girls found their niche. Chloe has her corporate law, and Dilys, Susan let her gaze flick toward me, landing with the weight of a stone. Dilys is doing just fine managing the clipboard out at the mill, keeping the trucks on schedule. It is honest work. A low chuckle rippled across the table. I did not flush. I did not defend myself. I simply picked up my fork and took a bite of cold turkey. Defending myself in this house was a tax I stopped paying a decade ago. What my mother called managing the clipboard was actually directing the entire logistical supply chain for Martin Timber and Land. My grandfather Silas built the company from a single rusted bandsaw in the 1960s. I did not just count trucks. I tracked every board foot of lumber, cross-referenced diesel fuel expenditures, and monitored the yield rates of 3 separate clear-cutting crews across northern Idaho. The numbers never blurred for me the way voices did. In a spreadsheet, there is no static. There is only the undeniable architecture of truth. Under the table, a foot bumped mine. I glanced up. Maya, my older brother Brandon's wife, sat across from me. She is a brilliant African-American architect from Chicago who married into the Martin family expecting a legacy of stoic timber barons. Instead, she found a room full of vipers. Maya caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Without drawing attention, she slid a second slice of pecan pie onto my bread plate. It was a silent transmission of solidarity. "Endure them," her dark eyes seemed to say. "Just get through the night." Brandon, oblivious to his wife, leaned forward to tap his fork against his water glass. "Speaking of the business, Dad, you promised an update. The holiday season is starting. People want to know where the company is headed." Richard wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, letting the silence stretch to assert his authority over the room. He stood, buttoning his tailored jacket. Since the family is gathered and we have esteemed friends at the table, I am proud to announce a new era for Martin Timber. For too long, we have let sentimentality dictate our assets. Grandpa Silas built a great foundation, yes, but holding thousands of acres of old-growth pine in a conservation trust while timber prices skyrocket is bad business. The room went still. Even Chloe stopped smiling. Effective at the end of the fiscal quarter, Richard continued, we are initiating a restructuring. We will begin selectively liquidating the protected parcels on the North Ridge. It is time to monetize the legacy. I set my fork down. The metal clicked sharp against the porcelain. My mind immediately began running the figures. The North Ridge parcels were not standard commercial timber. Silas had placed them in a restrictive trust specifically to act as a buffer for the local watershed. Beyond the environmental impact, the numbers made no sense. Martin Timber was highly profitable. Our quarterly yields were up 12%. We had zero operational need to liquidate restricted assets unless there was a deficit somewhere else. A deficit I had not seen on the books. You are cutting the ridge, Maya asked, her voice cutting through the celebratory hum. She looked at Brandon, seeking backup. Silas loved that acreage. He explicitly set it aside. Brandon shot her a warning glare, the kind that promised a fight in the car ride home. Dad knows what he is doing, Maya. Markets change. Exactly, Susan said smoothly, pouring more wine. We have to look to the future, especially with Chloe stepping into a leadership role soon. We need the capital liquid. The conversation moved on, shifting back to Harvard and golf handicaps. But the air in my lungs felt thin. I knew the mill output. I knew the revenue streams. If Richard was suddenly desperate for liquid capital, something was bleeding the company dry from the inside. Dinner concluded with the usual fanfare. The guests retreated to the den for cigars, and Chloe vanished upstairs to answer texts. I stood silently, collecting the heavy porcelain plates, stacking them with the practiced efficiency of a ghost in my own childhood home. I pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under harsh track lighting. I set the plates by the sink and gripped the edge of the counter, letting the ambient noise of the house wash over me, trying to untangle the math in my head. The door swung open again. Maya slipped inside, letting it shut softly behind her. She did not offer to help with the dishes. She stepped close, her expression stripped of the polite mask she wore in the dining room. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was dead level. He is lying, Delis, Maya whispered. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run to drown out our voices from anyone passing in the hall. About the restructuring. About all of it, Maya said. She glanced over her shoulder at the door. Brandon left his laptop unlocked on the kitchen island this morning. I was not trying to snoop, but a folder was open on the desktop. It was labeled North Ridge Appraisals. Dad wants to sell. He just announced it. He does not want to sell Delis. He has to sell. Maya stepped closer, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I saw the offshore transfer receipts. Richard is not liquidating Silas Forest to restructure the company. He is draining the accounts to fund Chloe's new life in Sun Valley. The trust is already empty. The water cascaded into the sink, hitting the porcelain like static. The main office of Martin Timber sat adjacent to the primary sorting yard. At 2 a.m, the yard was silent except for the hum of the perimeter floodlights and the distant rush of the river. I swiped my keycard and the heavy glass door clicked open. The air inside smelled of pine resin and stale coffee. My official title was Logistics Coordinator, which meant I had administrative access to the entire enterprise resource planning software. The digital system held the true heartbeat of the company. I sat at my desk in the dark and woke my monitor. The blue light washed over my face as I pulled the master ledger for the North Ridge sector. Maya had seen offshore transfer receipts. I needed to find where the money originated before it crossed the border. I did not look at the executive summary reports. Summary reports are where thieves hide their tracks. Instead, I opened the raw data tables for the logging equipment leases. This is where my brain functions differently than most. Where my father saw my slow response time in verbal conversations as a defect, he failed to realize that same brain processed numerical patterns with flawless precision. I scrolled through thousands of rows of purchase orders for heavy machinery. John Deere feller bunchers, Caterpillar skidders, grapple yarders. The lease payments were routing to a vendor Shell out of Delaware. I cross-referenced the machine identification numbers with our active GPS tracking logs. The tracking logs were empty. We were paying $100,000 quarterly leases on logging equipment that did not physically exist. I ran the aggregate totals for the past 3 fiscal cycles. The numbers stacked in my head, forming a clear, undeniable architecture of fraud. $2.5 million bled out of the operating budget, drop by drop, over 36 months. I printed the vendor payment history and placed it in a plain manila folder. I waited in my cubicle until the sun rose and the administrative staff began filtering into the building. At 8 o'clock, Brandon walked through the double doors wearing a tailored suit that looked ridiculous in a dusty lumberyard office. He carried a coffee and a leather briefcase, acting every bit the heir apparent. I followed him into his corner office, shutting the heavy oak door behind me. Brandon tossed his briefcase onto the leather sofa. "Morning, Dilly," he said, checking his silver watch. "Make it quick. I have a production call in 10 minutes. I set the manila folder on his glass desk. "We have a problem in the supply chain," I said, keeping my voice level. "Someone is running dummy leases through the Delaware Holding Company. We are paying for heavy machinery that is not in the field. $2.5 million is gone." Brandon froze. He did not look at the folder. He looked at the door. Then he let out a sharp, patronizing sigh and leaned against the edge of his desk. "You have been pulling night shifts again," he said, rubbing his temples. "You need to sleep." I pushed the folder an inch closer to him. "Look at the purchase orders, Brandon. The machine identification numbers do not match our fleet registry. The money is being diverted. If Dad is desperate for cash to fund Chloe, we have to stop him before he drains the company Grandpa Silas built." Brandon picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. His face hardened. He was no longer playing the busy executive. He was playing the older brother who knew best. "Delis, stop. You are doing that thing again." "What thing?" I asked. Getting confused, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You look at these complex spreadsheets and you get overwhelmed. You mix up the columns. It is your dyslexia or whatever processing issue you have. You are misreading the equipment depreciation schedules as dummy leases. Leave the accounting to the professionals." I stared at him. "I do not have dyslexia," I said. "I have an auditory delay. My reading comprehension is perfect. The numbers are fake." Brandon slammed his coffee cup onto the desk. The ceramic clattered against the glass, spilling dark liquid over the wood trim. "The numbers are fine," he snapped, dropping the friendly facade. "Do not play auditor, Dillis. You manage the truck routes. Stick to the clipboard. If you run around accusing Dad of embezzlement, people will just think you are acting out because Chloe outshines you." The door handle clicked. Maya stepped into the office. She held a stack of architectural blueprints, but her eyes darted between Brandon and me, taking in the sudden tension. She had heard enough through the thin drywall. "She is not acting out," Brandon, Maya said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge that made my brother flinch. "She is right. The Delaware accounts are a shell. I saw the wire transfers on your laptop yesterday morning." Brandon turned on his wife, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You were looking through my computer." "I was looking for the site mock-ups for the new visitor center," Maya shot back, standing her ground. "What I found was a paper trail of wire fraud. You are helping Richard steal from Silas. You are bankrupting your own family company to buy Chloe a mountain mansion." "Keep your voice down," Brandon hissed, pointing a finger at her. "You do not understand how this business works. Dad and I are protecting our assets." "By stealing them?" Maya asked. She dropped the blueprints onto a nearby chair. "I married a man who claimed he wanted to build things. I did not marry a thief." The argument escalated into a bitter back and forth. I stood near the desk, watching my brother defend the indefensible. The truth settled into my bones like winter frost. Brandon was not a victim of our father. He was a willing co-conspirator. The men in my family were united in their greed, and they had deemed me too stupid to notice. I did not stay to watch the rest of the fight. I picked up my manila folder and walked out of the office, leaving them to their fractured marriage. I drove my beat-up Ford truck out of the mill yard and headed up the mountain pass. The asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt. 10 miles past the city limits sat a small A-frame cabin tucked into a dense grove of Douglas firs. I built it myself 3 years ago, using reclaimed timber and sheer stubbornness. It smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. It was the one place in Idaho where the Martin family noise could not reach me. I walked inside, locked the deadbolt, and spread the documents across my kitchen table. I did not cry. Crying is a biological response to frustration, and I was no longer frustrated. I was auditing. I opened my personal laptop and bypassed the company firewall using a backdoor code I had written months ago. For the next 6 hours, I downloaded every financial record, every dummy lease, and every offshore wire transfer. I fired up my heavy-duty laser printer and watched the paper spill onto the output tray. Digital files can be deleted, passwords can be changed, network access can be revoked, but physical paper carries weight. It demands to be read. I took each printed ledger and organized them into individual dossiers, one for my father, one for my brother. I placed the thick stacks of evidence into a heavy steel fireproof lockbox and shoved it into a hidden compartment under my floorboards. I was not going to argue with them anymore. Arguing requires two sides to respect each other. I was going to build a case so bulletproof that their loud voices would mean nothing against the silent truth of my ledger. I was replacing the floorboards when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. An incoming email notification lit up the screen. The sender was Susan Martin, my mother. The subject line read, "Urgent schedule change for Chloe." I opened the message, standing in the quiet of my cabin. Due to an unexpected opening at the Sun Valley Resort, my mother wrote, "We are moving. Chloe, Harvard graduation and welcome home gala to this Saturday evening. We want the entire community to celebrate her brilliant achievements. Please ensure your schedules are clear. It will be a night to remember." I scrolled down to the bottom of the email where the digital event invitation was attached. The vendor name for the venue caught my eye. I walked back to my table and pulled the top sheet of paper from the Delaware Holding Company ledger. I ran my finger down the column of fraudulent wire transfers. The most recent dummy lease payment routed yesterday was issued to a high-end event management firm. It was the exact same firm hosting my sister gala. My father was not just stealing from my grandfather legacy. He was using the stolen money to throw a lavish party, celebrating my sister brilliance while leaving me to pay the price. I looked at the calendar on my wall. Saturday was 4 days away. The clock had just started ticking. The drive to Sun Valley takes 3 hours from the mill. I made the trip in my old truck while my parents and sister took a chartered helicopter. The resort is an enclave of extreme wealth nestled in the Sawtooth Mountains. It is a playground for corporate titans hiding behind a rustic aesthetic. They booked the grand ballroom for Saturday night. Walking into that space felt like stepping inside a jewelry box. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over silk table linens. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the snow-capped mountains. Every detail screamed of limitless capital. I knew exactly where that capital originated. I had the printed Delaware Holding Company ledgers sitting in a lockbox under my floorboards. Hundreds of Idaho elite filled the room. State senators, logging executives, and real estate developers clinked champagne flutes. The men wore custom tuxedos, and the women draped themselves in designer gowns. I wore a simple black dress I bought on clearance 3 years ago. When I handed my coat to the attendant, I scanned the seating chart near the entrance. The VIP tables were arranged near the center stage. My parents sat at table 1. My brother Brandon sat at table 2. My name was listed at table 47. Table 47 was pushed into a dark corner adjacent to the kitchen service doors. Every time a waiter rushed past, a cold draft hit my shoulders. I could smell the dishwashing detergent mixing with the scent of roasted tenderloin. My table mates were distant business associates who spent the first 10 minutes trying to figure out who I was. When I explained I worked in logistics for Martin Timber, their eyes glazed over and they returned to their own conversations. I sat in silence, drinking ice water. I was accustomed to this exact placement. For as long as I can remember, family gatherings were structured to keep me out of sight. I was the dull background character in the shining story of Chloe. At 8 o'clock, the string quartet stopped playing. The ballroom lights dimmed to a soft glow. A single spotlight illuminated the raised stage at the front of the room. My father walked up the stairs holding a microphone. Richard Martin knew how to captivate an audience. He stood tall, adjusting his jacket, waiting for the chatter to die down. He commanded respect simply by refusing to speak until he had total silence. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice echoing through the pristine sound system. Thank you for traveling to this beautiful valley to celebrate a milestone. We are here tonight to honor the future. A company is only as strong as the bloodline that sustains it. My own father, Silas, understood that when he bought his first acre of timber. He built a foundation. But a foundation is meant to be built upon. It requires vision. It requires intellect. It requires a leader who understands the complexities of the modern world. The audience clapped politely. I traced the edge of my water glass. The hypocrisy of his words tasted bitter. Silas did not build the company to create a modern corporate empire. He built it to provide stable jobs for the local community and to protect the land he respected. Richard was standing on stage preaching about legacy while actively draining the company accounts through dummy equipment leases. Tonight we celebrate the brightest mind in the next generation of our family, Richard continued, gesturing toward the front table. Chloe, please join me. My sister stood up. She wore a stunning emerald gown that likely cost more than my annual salary. She walked to the stage with measured, elegant steps. The applause swelled. She smiled, radiating a polished humility that she had perfected over years of social conditioning. She stood next to our father, looking out over the sea of wealthy guests. Chloe graduated in the top tier of her class at Harvard Law, Richard said, beaming with pride. She had offers from every major firm on the East Coast. But she knows where she belongs. She belongs here in Idaho, guiding the family enterprise into its next chapter. Effective Monday morning, Chloe will officially assume the title of Vice President of Operations for Martin Timber and Land. The ballroom erupted in loud cheers. Brandon stood up at table 2, clapping harder than anyone else. I remained seated in my dark corner. The title of Vice President of Operations meant she would technically be my direct supervisor. A woman who had never spent a single hour on a logging site, who did not know the difference between a feller buncher and a skidder, was now in charge of the entire physical supply chain. But a title is just a title, Richard said, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. A Martin executive needs a proper estate to host clients and conduct business. Therefore, to welcome her home, I am transferring the deed to the newly constructed Ridgeview property into her name. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even the wealthy guests were impressed. Ridgeview was not just a house. It was a $17 million architectural marvel built onto a cliff overlooking the valley. It featured indoor heated pools, private stables, and smart home technology. It was the crown jewel of the local real estate market. And because the drive down the mountain can be treacherous in the winter, Richard added, flashing a charismatic smile, I made sure there is a brand new Tesla Model S parked in the garage waiting for her. More applause. More cheers. Millions of dollars stolen from the family business, handed over in front of 300 witnesses as a graduation gift. I sat very still. My fingernails dug into my palms. I tried to focus on my breathing. I just needed the speech to end so I could quietly slip out the back doors and drive home. But Richard was not finished. He scanned the room, looking out toward the back tables. His eyes tried to pierce the dim lighting. "Now I know some of you are wondering about our other daughter," Richard said, his tone shifting from reverence to light mockery. "Do not worry about Dilys. We run a family operation. We always take care of our own. Chloe will be handling the high-level strategy, but Dilys will be allowed to keep her little clipboard out at the mill. Somebody has to count the trucks, right?" The punchline landed exactly as he intended. The wealthy guests chuckled. A low, rumbling wave of amusement washed over the ballroom. The people at my own table laughed, looking around to see if they could spot the punchline in person. I shrank down in my chair. The humiliation was visceral. It was a physical weight pressing against my chest. My throat tightened, and a hot sting gathered behind my eyes. I refused to let the tears fall. I stared down at my hands, focusing on the pale skin stretched over my knuckles. I told myself that the dummy Lises were safe in my cabin. I told myself that their laughter meant nothing against the math. But logic offers very little protection when your own father degrades you for sport. On stage, Chloe stepped forward and took the microphone from Richard. She looked out at the laughing crowd and held up a hand, playing the gracious peacemaker. "Thank you, Dad," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But seriously, we value all our employees, even the ones behind the scenes. I am just so humbled by this gift. I promise to work tirelessly to honor our grandfather vision. I promise to lead this company into a bold, new direction." She opened her mouth to continue her speech. She never got the chance. At the far end of the ballroom, the heavy oak double doors swung open. The sound was loud enough to cut through the quiet hum of the room. The event staff usually guarded those doors to prevent interruptions, but they stepped aside. A stranger walked into the room. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal-tailored suit that spoke of old money and quiet authority. He carried a leather briefcase. He did not pause at the check-in desk. He did not look at the stage. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride right down the center aisle. The guests closest to the doors stopped talking. The silence spread like a falling domino, reaching the center tables and finally washing up to the front row. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to identify the intruder. Chloe stood frozen with the microphone in her hand. The man ignored the VIP section entirely. He bypassed table 1. He bypassed table 2. He bypassed the state senators and the developers. He walked straight toward the back corner of the room, navigating the narrow space between the service station and my isolated seat at table 47. He stopped right in front of me. Up close, he had sharp, discerning eyes and silver hair. He looked down at my simple black dress and my white knuckles. "Dilys Martin?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "My name is Harrison," he said. "I am a corporate attorney based out of Seattle." He unlatched his leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed in the quiet corner. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of premium, cream-colored parchment. The back flap was secured with a dark red wax seal bearing a familiar insignia. It was my grandfather's personal crest. Harrison placed the envelope on the table right next to my water glass. The noise in the ballroom was returning now as people began whispering, trying to figure out what was happening. Richard was stepping off the stage, walking quickly in my direction, with security guards trailing behind him. I looked from the sealed envelope up to the attorney face. My hands began to shake. "What is this?" I whispered. Harrison leaned down, resting his hands on the table. He spoke softly, ensuring the words were meant only for me. "Your grandfather told me to hold this until the day they proved they could not be trusted. He said you would know what to do when they showed you who they really are." Harrison straightened his tie. "Open it, Dilys. It is time." The ballroom noise surged as my father pushed through the crowd. I did not wait for him to reach table 47. I grabbed the heavy parchment envelope and slipped backward through the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. The sudden transition from the opulent gala to the stark industrial workspace jolted my senses. Waiters rushed past, carrying silver trays of roasted meat and discarded champagne flutes. I dodged a rolling utility cart and navigated down a narrow cinder-block corridor that led toward the loading dock. The classical music from the party faded into a dull, thumping bass. The air back here was cold and smelled of industrial bleach. I found an empty alcove near the service elevator and pressed my back against the concrete wall. My hands were shaking. I forced my breathing to slow down, treating my rising panic the same way I treat a supply chain bottleneck. Isolate the variables, address the immediate required action. I traced the dark red wax seal with my thumb. Silas Martin had built his timber enterprise with his own calloused hands. He was a man of the earth who understood the value of deep roots and patience. When he died 3 years ago, the accepted family narrative claimed he passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving everything to his only son. Richard took the reins the very next morning without a single legal challenge. I dug my nail under the wax. The seal snapped with a sharp, definitive sound. I pulled out several pages of thick legal text. The header bore the insignia of a prominent Seattle corporate law firm. It was the last will and testament of Silas Martin. The date stamped at the top right corner was just 2 weeks before his death. I leaned against the cold wall and began to read. The legal jargon was dense, but my mind organized the clauses into a clear mathematical structure. I skipped past the standard boilerplate language and found the primary asset division located on page 3. To my granddaughter, Dilys Martin, I bequeath 51% of the controlling shares of Martin Holdings. My breath caught in my throat. I read the sentence again, letting the words anchor themselves in my mind. Martin Holdings was not just the timber mill. The mill was only a single operational subsidiary. The holding company owned the physical land, the logging rights, the commercial real estate in Boise, and the liquid investment accounts. It was the overarching umbrella of the entire family enterprise. The current market valuation stood at $58 million. Silas had not left me a logistics clipboard. He had left me the kingdom. But Silas knew his son. He knew Richard would fight tooth and nail to maintain total dominance over the family wealth. I scanned the next paragraph and found the contingency clause. To activate this transfer of ownership, Dilys Martin must formally assert her claim and petition the corporate board of directors for an emergency session within 72 hours of receiving this document. Should she fail to meet this strict deadline, the shares will revert entirely to Richard Martin. 72 hours. The ticking clock echoed in my head. It was Saturday night. I had until Tuesday evening to maneuver past a father who controlled the corporate board, the high-priced defense lawyers, and the local judges. If I hesitated, I would lose everything. If I made one misstep, the holding company would default to the man currently draining it dry. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. I quickly folded the papers, holding them tight against my chest. Harrison turned the corner. The corporate attorney had managed to slip away from the ballroom chaos unnoticed. He stopped a few feet away, checking his surroundings to ensure we were alone. "Your father is searching the lobby for you," Harrison said. His voice was a calm, steady baritone. "He thinks he ran out the front doors." "Why did you wait 3 years to give this to me?" I asked. Harrison leaned against the opposite wall, smoothing his tie. "I was bound by strict attorney-client privilege and a very specific set of instructions. Silas knew Richard would try to bury this document." Richard found an early draft of this will months before Silas passed. "Your father could not destroy the finalized version because it was secured in my private vault, but he could ensure you were never in a position to execute it." I clicked the pieces together, running the historical data through my mind. That is why Richard kept me in the logistics department. That is why my salary barely covered my property taxes and basic living expenses. He was starving me out. Harrison nodded, confirming my audit of the situation. "Legal battles require capital. Your father isolated you financially, making sure you lived paycheck to paycheck. He figured if you ever discovered the truth, you would lack the required resources to hire legal counsel or fight a protracted court battle. He structured your life to keep you powerless." But Silas anticipated that strategy as well. He told me to wait until Richard became arrogant enough to expose his own vulnerability. "Tonight, your father publicly transferred stolen corporate assets to your sister. He handed you the exact leverage you need to destroy him." I looked down at the envelope in my hands. A small folded piece of yellow legal paper was tucked inside the bottom crease. I pulled it out. The handwriting was jagged and familiar. It was a note from my grandfather, written in blue ink. When I was 10 years old, Silas used to take me hunting in the Bitterroot forests. While Brandon and Richard made noise and scared the wildlife away, I would sit perfectly still for hours watching the tree line. Silas never called me slow. He understood my quiet nature. I unfolded the yellow paper. Dilys, the note read, "They think your silence is a defect. They think because you do not speak quickly, you do not see clearly. Let them believe it. A loud man announces his targets. A quiet woman observes the wind, calculates the distance, and waits for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Your silence is not weakness. It is the vision of a sniper. Do not let them take what I built. Take it back." A strange, profound calm settled over me, replacing the lingering panic. For 29 years, I had accepted the role of the family scapegoat. I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I had paid my dues in silence while they spent my inheritance. But the ledger was now in my hands. I held the deed to the entire operation. Chloe and her brand new $17 million mansion sat on land owned by Martin Holdings. The luxury electric vehicle in her garage was purchased with holding company funds. I owned 51% of their fraudulent lifestyle. I needed a strategic plan. I needed to cross-reference the Delaware Shell Company documents hidden in my cabin with this new legal will. I needed to secure a board sponsor before the 72-hour window slammed shut. I started to place the documents back into the wax-sealed envelope. I thanked Harrison and turned toward the heavy exit door at the end of the hall. The metal handle clicked open before I could reach it. High heels clacked sharply against the concrete floor. My mother, Susan, marched into the corridor. Her face was flushed, and her usual polished demeanor had cracked under the pressure of a missing scapegoat. She carried her expensive clutch purse like a weapon. She stopped abruptly when she saw me, standing next to a stranger in a tailored suit. Her eyes darted from Harrison to the heavy parchment envelope in my hands. The air in the hallway turned hostile. Susan narrowed her eyes, her gaze locking onto the legal documents. "What are you doing back here, Dilys?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "Your father is tearing the resort apart looking for you. Who is this man, and what exactly are you hiding in that envelope?" Susan stared at the heavy parchment envelope in my hands. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, steady drone. I did not step back. I tightened my grip on the paper and met my mother's angry gaze. Her eyes darted from the red wax seal to Harrison, taking in his expensive charcoal suit. She demanded to know what I was hiding. I kept my breathing even and my heart rate steady. Panic is a variable that ruins a good calculation. I looked Susan in the eye and delivered a simple, boring lie. "It is a vendor dispute," I said, holding the envelope loosely against my chest to make it seem unimportant. "The catering management firm miscalculated their equipment transport fees for tonight. They cornered me in the hallway trying to renegotiate the service terms." Susan narrowed her eyes, studying my face. She looked at Harrison, waiting for confirmation. Harrison did not miss a beat. He extended a hand toward my mother, offering a polite corporate smile. "Harrison Miller," he said, adopting a false surname. "I represent the Regional Logistics Union. We have a slight discrepancy regarding the delivery union dues for the champagne pallets. Your daughter was just explaining the event budget constraints." My mother ignored his outstretched hand. The tension drained from her shoulders, replaced instantly by a wave of aristocratic annoyance. She scoffed and adjusted her designer clutch. "Of course you are dealing with delivery trucks during a formal gala," she muttered, shaking her head. "Chloe is on stage, securing the future of our empire, and you are back here arguing with union reps over pallet fees? Do try to show some class, Dilys. Put the paperwork away and return to the kitchen. You are embarrassing us by loitering in the service corridors." Susan turned on her heel and marched back toward the ballroom, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. I waited until the metal doors swung shut before letting out a breath. Harrison nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the narrow escape. He turned and walked toward the exit, disappearing into the night. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket, walked out the service doors, and drove my beat-up truck back up the mountain. Sunday morning broke over the Idaho wilderness with a sharp, biting cold. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of Douglas firs, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards of my A-frame cabin. I built this home myself 3 years ago. I sourced the reclaimed timber, laid the foundation, and installed the wood stove. It was small and austere, but it belonged to me. The walls held no judgment, and the silence offered perfect clarity. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee. The Delaware Shell Company ledgers sat on my left. Silas' finalized will sat on my right. I spent the early morning hours cross-referencing the dates. The timeline was irrefutable. Richard began setting up the dummy equipment leases exactly 2 weeks after Silas passed away. My father had wasted no time draining the holding company the moment he assumed control. The numbers formed a perfect, unbroken chain of theft, routing millions into the offshore accounts that built Chloe new life. I checked the calendar. The 72-hour window was shrinking. I needed to secure a board sponsor and force the emergency session by Tuesday evening. I reached for my pen to draft a timeline. The crunch of gravel broke the forest silence. It was a distinct, heavy sound, followed by the soft, unnatural hum of an electric engine. I walked to the front window and pushed aside the curtain. A sleek, midnight silver Tesla Model S navigated the muddy ruts of my driveway. The luxury vehicle looked absurd against the backdrop of rugged pine and untreated dirt. The car came to a stop near my woodpile. The driver's side door opened, and Chloe stepped out. She wore pristine suede boots and a cashmere coat, stepping carefully to avoid the mud. She looked around my property with an expression of mild distaste, as if inspecting a condemned building. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, letting the cold air hit my face. "Good morning, Dilly," Chloe said, waving a manicured hand. She did not walk up the steps. She stayed near her new car, keeping a safe distance from my lifestyle. "This driveway is a nightmare. You really need to grade the gravel. My undercarriage scraped twice coming up the hill." "It is a logging road," I replied, crossing my arms to ward off the chill. "What are you doing here, Chloe?" She sighed, examining a scuff mark on her suede boot. "I came to do you a favor. Dad was going to send a formal legal notice, but I told him I should handle it personally. We are family, after all." "Handle what?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. Chloe looked up, offering that same practiced, modest smile she wore on stage the night before. "Well, you heard the announcement. I am officially the Vice President of Operations, and Ridgeview is spectacular. But the property taxes on a $17 million estate are steep. We ran the numbers this morning. To ensure my personal overhead does not impact the corporate bottom line, Dad is liquidating a few of our non-essential land assets." She paused, waiting for me to connect the dots. When I remained silent, she rolled her eyes and gestured toward my cabin. "This parcel is prime real estate, Dilly. We found a luxury developer from Boise who wants to clear the trees and build a boutique eco-resort right here. The sale covers my property taxes for the next decade. The contracts are already signed." I stared at her, letting the sheer cruelty of her words hang in the freezing air. My sister was standing in my front yard, casually explaining that she was rendering me homeless to pay the taxes on a mansion she received through corporate embezzlement. "You are selling the land under my house," I stated. "Technically, it is company land," Chloe corrected, waving her hand dismissively. "You just built a shack on it." "Do not be dramatic. We are giving you plenty of time to sort things out. You have 14 days to pack up and vacate the premises. The demolition crews arrive on the 15th. You can probably rent a little apartment down in town near the mill. It will be much closer to your logistics job anyway." A silver SUV turned onto the dirt road, cutting off whatever else my sister planned to say. The vehicle pulled in behind the Tesla. Maya shifted the SUV into park and stepped out into the cold. She wore a heavy wool sweater and carried 2 brown paper grocery bags in her arms. She stopped noticing the tension vibrating between the porch and the driveway. "Maya, Chloe," said her voice dipping into a condescending register. "We did not expect you up here. Are you lost?" Maya adjusted her grip on the groceries. "I am dropping off some supplies for Delis. Since the family seems so focused on cutting dead weight, I figured she might need coffee. Chloe sneered, shaking her head. Family loyalty is clearly a foreign concept to you, Maya. Try to support your husband instead of running errands for the disgruntled help. Chloe turned back to me, pointing a finger. 14 days, Dealey. Do not make Dad send the sheriff to drag you out. Chloe climbed back into her Tesla and reversed down the muddy driveway. The electric engine whined softly as she disappeared into the tree line, leaving a trail of deep tire tracks in the earth. I stood on the porch watching the empty road. The reality of the deadline settled over me. They were not just stealing my grandfather's legacy. They were actively trying to erase my existence from the mountain. Maya walked up the wooden steps and handed me one of the paper bags. It was heavy, filled with canned goods and fresh produce. I opened the door and ushered her inside out of the biting wind. We set the groceries on the kitchen counter next to the stacks of printed ledgers. Maya looked around the small cabin, taking in the warmth of the wood stove and the simple, quiet peace of the room. "It is a beautiful home, Dilys," she said softly. "They are tearing it down in 2 weeks," I said, unpacking a bag of coffee beans. "Chloe needs the tax money." Maya scoffed, leaning against the counter. "They will never see a dime of that developer money." I paused, holding the coffee. I looked at my sister-in-law. Her eyes were dark with exhaustion, but her posture was rigid with newfound resolve. She did not look like a woman mourning a fractured marriage. She looked like a woman who had finally decided to jump off a sinking ship. "I filed the divorce papers this morning," Maya stated. "I left them on the kitchen island, right next to Brandon's coffee mug." I packed a single suitcase and drove straight here. I am done pretending they are decent people. I refuse to drown with that family. I nodded, understanding the profound weight of her decision. Escaping the Martin family requires leaving everything behind. "You did the right thing, Maya. Brandon chose his greed over you." She reached into the pocket of her heavy wool sweater. Her fingers closed around a small object. Before I left, I went into his home office. Brandon thinks he is a mastermind, but his arrogance makes him sloppy. He uses the same generic password for every secure device. Maya pulled her hand from her pocket and placed a small silver flash drive onto the wooden table, right on top of Silas' finalized will. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the metal casing. "It is a digital backup from Richard's private legal files," Maya explained. "Brandon was reviewing them late last night. I copied the most recent folder before I walked out the door. Dilys, they know Silas left something behind. Richard never found the original will, but he suspects a contingency plan exists." I picked up the flash drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "What are they doing?" "They are closing the trap," Maya said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Richard drew up a shareholder dissolution agreement. It legally revokes your minority standing in the holding company and transfers all voting rights directly to him. The paperwork requires your signature to be binding." "I will never sign that," I said. Maya looked at me, her expression grim. "You do not have to. Richard practiced forging your signature on the digital drafts. I saw the scanned copies. He plans to submit the fraudulent dissolution forms to the state registry tomorrow morning. If that paperwork processes, your legal standing is erased. The 72-hour window will mean absolutely nothing because you will no longer exist as a recognized shareholder." The ticking clock in my head suddenly accelerated. Tuesday evening was no longer the deadline. The deadline was tomorrow morning. My father was moving to permanently dissolve my rights before the sun came up. I took the small silver flash drive from the table and pushed it into the side port of my laptop. The operating system chimed in the quiet cabin. A single folder appeared on the screen labeled Legal Drafts. I moved my cursor and opened it. Inside were dozens of digital files and scanned images. I clicked on the most recent upload. The document loaded slowly across my screen, revealing a standard shareholder dissolution agreement. It was the specific type of paperwork utilized when a minority partner decides to cash out, surrendering all voting rights to the majority stakeholder. I scrolled down to the bottom of the second page. My full legal name was printed on the signature line. Right above those printed letters sat a handwritten signature. The loops and sharp angles were a pristine replication of how I signed my daily logistics manifests down at the lumberyard. But I had never touched this piece of paper. My father and brother had spent their private evening hours practicing my handwriting. They were crossing a dangerous and irreversible line. Emotional neglect and workplace marginalization were internal family matters. Forging a signature on a corporate governance document to steal a controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar holding company was outright federal fraud. I sat back in my wooden chair listening to the fire crackle inside the iron stove. Maya stood near the kitchen sink watching me process the information. She understood the gravity of what we were viewing on the glowing monitor. I looked at Silas' finalized will sitting next to the computer. The 72-hour contingency clause was clear. I could drive down to the local courthouse tomorrow morning and file the necessary paperwork to execute my grandfather's true wishes. But the American legal system is a grueling game, played primarily by those who possess abundant liquid capital. If I simply invoked the will, Richard would immediately contest its validity. He would utilize the millions he diverted from the timber mill to hire a small army of defense attorneys. They would drag the probate process out for years. They would bury me in endless injunctions, discovery requests, and procedural delays. I had no savings to pay a premium retainer. By the time a judge finally issued a ruling, I would be bankrupt, and the company would be reduced to a hollow shell. Handing them the will was not a sufficient strategy. I needed undeniable leverage. I needed a weapon so sharp they would surrender their positions without a single fight. I leaned closer to the monitor. Forensic accounting is not merely about tracking random numbers. It is about understanding the hidden narrative those figures construct. I opened the Properties tab on the forged document. The digital metadata displayed the exact date and time the file was created. I pulled up my printed physical ledgers for the Delaware Shell Company. I cross-referenced the creation timestamp of the forgery with the dates of the outgoing offshore wire transfers. The financial pattern emerged instantly, mapping a flawless trail of deceit. Richard drafted the fake dissolution agreement on the exact same morning he authorized the final payment to the Sun Valley real estate developers. He needed my minority shares legally erased before the property deed for Chloe's new mansion cleared escrow. If I retained my standing, I could trigger an internal audit on that specific real estate transaction. He forged my name to cover his tracks regarding the embezzlement. The two separate crimes were permanently tethered together by a single string of routing numbers. I reached for a fresh stack of blank printer paper and began to build my arsenal. I stripped all lingering emotion from the process. Anger is a heavy distraction, and grief is a terrible waste of energy. I focused purely on the cold mathematics of justice. I created 3 distinct physical dossiers, arranging them across my wooden table. The first manila folder belonged to Richard. I filled it with the fake Delaware equipment leases, the offshore banking codes, and the metadata proving he authored the forged signature. His specific crime was systemic wire fraud coupled with grand corporate embezzlement. He was the architect of the theft. The second folder was designated for Brandon. I included the internal emails Maya copied where my brother explicitly authorized the fake maintenance schedules for the non-existent logging machines. He provided the logistical cover story required to fool the accountants. His crime was conspiracy to commit fraud and the deliberate falsification of corporate records. The third folder belonged to Chloe. My sister loved to portray herself as the innocent, brilliant beneficiary of our father's boundless generosity. But her hands were stained with the exact same dirt. I printed the county tax records for the Ridgeview estate and the initial purchase order for the luxury electric vehicle. As the newly appointed vice president of operations, Chloe was legally required to verify the source of all executive compensation. Ignorance is never a valid defense under state corporate law. By accepting stolen assets, she became a direct accessory to the embezzlement. Maya walked over and inspected the 3 folders. She traced her finger over Brandon's name on the center tab. I expected her to show a hint of sadness, but her expression remained resolute. The man she married was buried inside that folder, reduced to a series of fraudulent transactions and cowardly decisions. She looked up at me and gave a single, decisive nod. The audit was complete. We had successfully translated years of psychological torment into a standardized legal format. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, feeling the caffeine hum through my veins. The sun was fully up now, casting a bright, blinding glare across the snowpack outside. My mind was sharp, operating at maximum capacity. I had spent my entire adult life cataloging inventory, calculating load weights, and optimizing delivery routes for men who thought I was defective. They had trained me to be meticulous. They had forced me to pay attention to the smallest details while they ignored the glaring deficits in their own character. Now I was going to use those exact logistical skills to dismantle their entire operation, piece by piece. I set the 3 thick dossiers in a neat row. They represented the impending destruction of the Martin family hierarchy. The math was flawless. The evidence was irrefutable. I just needed to present it to the corporate board of directors before the deadline expired. My cell phone buzzed on the table, breaking the deep silence of the forest. The caller identification displayed an unknown Seattle area code. I picked the device up and answered. Harrison spoke before I could even say a word. His voice lacked the calm, steady rhythm he possessed at the gala the night before. "Dillis," he said, sounding slightly out of breath, "we have a serious problem." I stood up, pacing the short distance from the table to the front window. "What happened?" I asked. "Your father is moving much faster than we anticipated," Harrison explained. "Someone at the resort recognized me from a previous corporate litigation case in Boise. They informed Richard that a Seattle attorney was speaking privately to his youngest daughter in the service corridor. Your father panicked. He knows the timeline is compromised." I watched the harsh winter wind whip through the pine branches outside my window. "What is his countermeasure?" I asked, keeping my tone flat and even. "He just issued an emergency mandate to the entire corporate board of directors," Harrison said. "He is bypassing the standard required notice period." Richard moved the final liquidation vote. The board meeting is no longer scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. It is happening tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. He is going to push the land sale through and submit the forged dissolution forms before you have a chance to enter the room. I ended the call with Harrison and lowered my phone. The quiet inside my cabin felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a countdown. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Richard was accelerating his endgame to ensure my legal erasure happened before the business day properly began. I looked at Maya. She stood near the wood stove reading my expression. "He moved the board meeting," I said. "Tomorrow morning at 8. Maya shook her head. "He cannot just call an emergency vote without formal notice." "He controls the executive committee," I replied. "He can do whatever he wants unless a sitting board member challenges the motion on the floor." That was the critical flaw in Silas' final will. A 72-hour window provided a theoretical safeguard, but it required access to the boardroom. The corporate bylaws for Martin Holdings dictated that non-executive shareholders could only introduce emergency motions if sponsored by an active board member. Richard owned the loyalty of 11 directors. They were golfing buddies, local politicians, and investors who profited from my father and his careless spending habits. I needed a sponsor. I needed the 12th man. "I need to find Vance," I said, reaching for my heavy winter coat. Vance was an Idaho institution. He built a potato farming empire from scratch, turning a modest agricultural yield into a statewide distribution network. More importantly, he was my grandfather's oldest friend. Silas placed Vance on the holding company board decades ago to serve as a designated voice of reason. Vance despised corporate politics. He lived off-grid on a sprawling ranch near the base of the mountains, refusing to carry a cell phone or check digital emails. Richard kept him on the board strictly for public relations, treating him as a silent relic of a bygone era. I checked the weather forecast on my laptop. A deep pressure system was moving over the Bitterroot Range. The radar map glowed with heavy crimson and purple bands. A severe winter storm was already dumping several inches of snow across the higher elevations. The local highway patrol issued travel advisories, warning drivers to stay off the mountain passes. "You cannot drive in this," Maya said, pointing toward the window. "The sky is turning black. The roads will ice over before you reach the valley floor." I grabbed the 3 thick manila folders containing the forensic audit. I placed them inside a waterproof canvas messenger bag. I dropped the silver flash drive into the front pocket. "If I wait out the storm, Richard submits the forged dissolution papers," I told her. "The 72-hour window closes, and Chloe gets to pave over this cabin to pay her property taxes. I have to go now." Maya watches me zip the canvas bag. She understood the harsh geometry of our situation. We had the math, but we lacked the microphone. She grabbed her car keys from the kitchen counter. "I will drive down to the logistics office," she said. "I can access the internal schedule and monitor Richard emails to see if he changes the venue again. I will call Harrison and keep him updated. Be careful, Dilys." We walked out onto the front porch. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in the last hour. The wind howled through the pine branches, carrying thick, blinding sheets of white snow. I climbed into my old Ford truck and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, protesting the bitter cold, before catching with a rough mechanical roar. I engaged the 4-wheel drive, shifted into gear, and rolled down the muddy driveway into the teeth of the blizzard. The mountain pass was a desolate stretch of winding asphalt. Within 10 minutes, the familiar landmarks disappeared. The towering Douglas firs vanished behind a solid curtain of swirling white. Whiteout conditions in Idaho do not merely obscure your vision. They disorient your sense of gravity. The horizon blends into the sky, creating a terrifying, endless gray void. My truck heater struggled to clear the frost forming on the inside of the windshield, blowing only a stream of lukewarm air. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the tires slip against the accumulating slush. This drive was a physical manifestation of my entire existence within the Martin family. Fighting for traction in the dark, constantly pushed toward the edge of a steep drop, while unseen forces tried to run me off the road. Every time the back end of the truck kicked out on a patch of black ice, I steered into the skid, correcting the momentum. My parents had conditioned me to believe I was slow, but navigating a treacherous, icy mountain road required split-second processing. The static in my brain was gone. I saw the patterns in the snowdrifts, anticipating the slick curves before my headlights reached them. The isolation of the storm threatened to erode my nerve. The wind battered the metal doors, roaring like a freight train. To keep my mind anchored, I reached over and pressed a button on my dashboard console. I navigated to my saved audio files. I selected a voicemail from 3 years ago. The static cracked through my stereo speakers, followed by the gruff, raspy voice of Grandpa Silas. "Hey, Dilly." Silas' voice filled the cold cabin. "Just calling to check on you. I saw the logistics report you filed for the clear-cutting crews. Your father missed the fuel discrepancy, but you caught it. Good work, kid. Do not let Richard tell you how to think. You have a good head on those shoulders. A quiet river carves the deepest canyon. Keep your eyes open. See you Sunday." I let the recording loop. A quiet river carves the deepest canyon. I repeated the phrase out loud, letting the sound of my own voice fight back against the howling wind. I was not the dumb one. I was the silent current slowly carving away their foundation. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and pressed the accelerator, pushing the old Ford harder into the storm. It took 2 agonizing hours to cover 20 miles. By the time I reached the valley floor, the snow had turned into a relentless, freezing rain. The dirt road leading to Vance Ranch was heavily rutted and washed out in several places. I navigated a final steep incline and parked my truck near a sprawling wooden barn. The ranch house sat a few hundred yards away, glowing with warm yellow light against the dark sky. I grabbed my canvas messenger bag, wrapped my coat tight around my neck, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The mud sucked at my boots as I trudged toward the front porch. I knocked on the heavy oak door. A golden retriever barked somewhere deep inside the house. The door swung open. Vance stood in the entryway, wearing faded denim jeans and a thick flannel shirt. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and sharp, calculating eyes. He looked past me, inspecting the blizzard raging in his front yard, before his gaze settled on my face. "Dilys Martin," he said, his voice carrying a rough, gravelly texture. "You picked a hell of a night to come off the mountain." "I need your help, Vance," I said, shivering as the freezing rain soaked through my coat. He stepped back, motioning for me to enter. The house smelled of wood smoke and roasted meat. He led me into a large, rustic living room and handed me a dry towel. I wiped the ice from my face and pulled the heavy canvas bag from my shoulder. "I need you to sponsor an emergency motion at the corporate board meeting tomorrow morning," I said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "Richard is trying to liquidate the holding company." Vance walked over to a stone fireplace and tossed another log onto the flames. He did not look surprised. He looked tired. "Your father called an emergency session an hour ago," Vance said, staring at the fire. "He sent a courier down here with the paperwork. Richard claims the timber mill is operating at a crippling deficit. He says selling the North Ridge is the only way to save the jobs of 300 local workers." "He is lying," I stated, stepping closer to the hearth. "The mill is profitable. He is embezzling the funds to pay for Chloe's new estate in Sun Valley. Silas left me a finalized will. I own 51% of the holding company, but I need you to sponsor me on the floor so I can present the claim." Vance turned around. His expression was hard, unyielding. "I loved your grandfather, Dilys. Silas was a good man. But ever since he died, this family has turned into a toxic swamp. Richard is a shark, and Brandon is a remora feeding off the scraps. I stay on that board to protect the farmers who rely on our supply chains. I do not get involved in Martin family soap operas." "This is not a soap opera," I argued. "This is a hostile takeover built on federal fraud." Vance crossed his arms. "If I walk into that boardroom tomorrow and sponsor a motion to halt the liquidation, I am declaring war on your father. Richard will use every lawyer on his payroll to destroy my agricultural contracts. I will not risk my farm and my employees just because you and your sister are fighting over an inheritance." He pointed a calloused finger at me. "I am not playing the pawn in a rich family dispute. Unless you have bulletproof, undeniable proof that Richard is committing financial ruin, I am staying out of it. Go home, Dilys. The storm is getting worse." I do not argue with Vance. Arguing is a waste of breath. I walk toward the wooden coffee table resting in the center of his rustic living room. I unzip my waterproof canvas bag and pull out my laptop. I retrieve the silver flash drive and push it into the side port. I power the machine on, letting the blue light wash over the dim space. I do not show him the standard executive spreadsheets right away. Those documents are designed to hide the truth. I open the forged dissolution agreement first. "Look at the signature line," I tell him, pointing at the screen. "Now look at the digital metadata displaying the creation timestamp. Richard generated this specific file on his personal computer 3 days ago. My father practiced forging my name to legally erase my minority shares." I open a second window displaying the Delaware Shell accounts. "Look at the wire transfer logs," I say, keeping my voice steady. "The routing numbers align perfectly with the property taxes and construction fees for the Sun Valley real estate. The men running this company are stealing millions to fund a luxury lifestyle while claiming poverty to justify liquidating the protected forests." Vance leans over the screen. His weathered face tightens. My grandfather trusted him because Vance understood the value of hard work over smooth talking. Vance spent 30 years growing potatoes in volcanic soil, turning a modest agricultural operation into a statewide distribution network. He built his life with his hands, not with offshore wire transfers. He recognizes rot when he sees it. He traces the financial pipeline with a calloused finger, following the money trail, drop by drop. $2.5 million drained through dummy equipment leases. They are buying luxury electric vehicles with the heavy machinery maintenance budget, Vance whispers. The realization hits him hard. The operational deficit is an artificial construct. Richard manufactured a financial crisis to justify selling the land Silas swore to protect. The betrayal of his old friend legacy is right there in black and white. "I need you in that boardroom tomorrow morning," I tell him. If you do not sponsor my emergency motion, Richard submits this forged document to the state registry. My legal standing evaporates. The company falls apart, and 300 local workers lose their jobs to feed his greed. Vance stands up straight. The exhaustion leaves his eyes, replaced by a cold, rigid resolve. Silas built that timber mill to feed this community, Vance says, his voice vibrating with anger. I will be at the Boise headquarters at 7:30. Bring the evidence, Dillis. We will dismantle your father's scheme, piece by piece. I leave the ranch and steer my old Ford back onto the icy asphalt. The winter storm is finally breaking. The heavy snow transitions into a light, freezing drizzle. The digital clock on my dashboard reads 11 at night. The fuel gauge needle hovers near empty. I need gasoline to make it back up the mountain to my cabin and then down to the corporate offices in the morning. I take the east exit toward a desolate truck stop located on the edge of town. The station sits under flickering halogen lights, surrounded by miles of dark, empty fields. I pull up to the fuel pump and step out into the bitter wind. I swipe my debit card and grab the heavy nozzle. While the tank fills, I walk inside the convenience store to buy a bottle of water. The clerk sits behind bulletproof glass, watching a small television monitor. I pay for my drink and head back toward the exit. My brother Brandon always possessed an obsession with surveillance. Growing up, he lacked the natural charisma our father displayed in public. To compensate, Brandon utilized strict control mechanisms. When he took over the logistical operations, he installed GPS tracking units in every single company vehicle. He claimed the technology optimized delivery routes. In reality, the software allowed him to micromanage the drivers and assert dominance over people who earned an honest living. He tracked idle times and penalized workers for taking unauthorized bathroom breaks. He enjoyed watching the digital dots move across his screen, playing a quiet game of supremacy. I drive a company truck. My vehicle is hardwired into that exact tracking network. I push open the glass doors of the convenience store and walk back out into the freezing drizzle. The halogen lights cast a sickly yellow glow over the wet concrete. I approach my truck and hear a strange crunching sound under my boots. I stop dead in my tracks. The passenger side window is gone. Tiny cubes of shattered safety glass cover the front seat, sparkling like crushed ice under the harsh overhead lighting. The cold wind howls through the open metal frame. I drop my water bottle. The plastic thuds against the pavement. I lunge toward the open window and look inside the cabin. My waterproof canvas bag is sitting exactly where I left it, on the floorboard. But the zipper is pulled wide open. I reach inside frantically, feeling around the dark interior. My laptop is missing. The silver flash drive containing the digital copies of the forged dissolution agreement is gone. The heavy manila folders holding the initial forensic audit are vanished. Someone followed me. Someone tracked my precise location, waited for me to walk inside the store, and stripped my arsenal in less than 90 seconds. I lean against the cold metal door, trying to process the violation. The freezing rain coats my hair and runs down my neck. The primary evidence is gone. The digital metadata proving Richard forged my signature is gone. The offshore routing numbers linking Brandon to the dummy equipment leases are stolen. They took everything I needed to show the corporate board. My cell phone vibrates in my coat pocket. The sudden buzzing feels like a physical strike against my ribs. I pull the device out and stare at the glowing screen. A new text message sits in my inbox. The sender is Brandon. I swipe the notification open. Some people just are not careful with company property, my brother writes. It is a dangerous night to leave your electronics sitting on the front seat. Go home, Dilly. The adults have a board meeting to run in the morning. The message radiates pure, unadulterated arrogance. Brandon sat in his warm house, monitoring my GPS coordinates, realizing I was visiting the only board member capable of stopping their liquidation plan. He drove out into the storm, smashed my window, and stole the digital evidence. The antagonists think they have neutralized the threat. They think taking my laptop removes my ability to fight. They believe I am just a frightened girl standing in the freezing rain with nothing left to defend myself. I stare at the shattered glass covering my passenger seat. a strange sensation washes over me. I do not feel panic. I do not feel despair. Instead, a cold, rigid smile creeps across my face. My jaw tightens as the final pieces of the puzzle snap into a perfect, unyielding alignment. Brandon stole the laptop. He stole the flash drive. He stole the 3 manila folders I prepared. But Brandon is arrogant, and arrogance breeds fatal oversights. He assumes my entire strategy relies on modern technology. He thinks because I am young, I only operate on digital screens and portable hard drives. He does not know about the heavy steel fireproof lockbox hidden under the floorboards of my A-frame cabin. He forgot that I am a logistician who spends every day cross-referencing physical paper manifests. He does not know I spent the entire afternoon utilizing my heavy-duty laser printer. I created hard copy ledgers of every single dummy lease and offshore wire transfer. I printed out the metadata and filed the physical papers away in the dark. He stole the digital copies. The physical, immutable truth is still sitting exactly where I left it, waiting for me to retrieve it. I brush the broken glass off the driver's seat and climb behind the wheel. The cold air rushes through the shattered window, biting at my face. I do not care. I shift the truck into gear and speed out of the gas station, turning the wheel toward the mountain pass. I am driving straight to my cabin. The 72-hour window is closing, but the math remains unbroken. The dawn broke over the Idaho capital, painting the city skyline in bruised shades of purple and gold. I steered my damaged Ford truck down the final stretch of the mountain highway, shivering as the morning wind whipped through the shattered passenger window. The storm had passed, leaving a bitter, freezing chill in its wake. On the floorboard, next to my heavy winter boots, sat the gray steel fireproof lockbox. Inside that metal casing lay the physical hard copy ledgers representing the undeniable truth of Martin Holdings. The 72-hour window established by my grandfather was rapidly collapsing. The emergency board meeting was scheduled to commence at 8 o'clock. I pulled into the corporate parking structure precisely at 7:15. The Martin Timber headquarters stood as a towering monument to modern corporate vanity. Silas operated his entire life out of a humble wooden field office, smelling of cedar and diesel fuel. Richard, however, insisted on erecting a sleek tower of imported glass and polished steel in the center of Boise. The building felt entirely disconnected from the rugged wilderness that generated its wealth. I grabbed the cold handle of the lockbox and hauled it out of the truck cabin. The metal container weighed nearly 30 pounds, holding thousands of printed pages and offshore routing manifests. I carried it with both hands, letting the physical strain anchor my focus. The dull ache in my forearms served as a constant reminder of the burden I was finally preparing to set down. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling lobby. The floors were lined with pristine white marble, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. An enormous curved reception desk sat in the center, manned by a uniformed guard checking employee badges. Maya stood near a row of black leather waiting chairs. She wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the fierce Chicago architect she was before marrying my brother. She saw the heavy lockbox in my arms and gave a curt, approving nod. She fell into step beside me, acting as a silent shadow as we approached the main elevator bank. We were moving with logistical precision, calculating the exact time required to reach the executive floor. Before I could press the call button, a sharp, familiar voice echoed across the marble floor. "Delis, stop right there." I turned around. My mother, Susan, marched across the lobby with Chloe trailing closely behind her. Susan wore a designer cashmere coat and pristine leather gloves. Her face was set in a mask of deep maternal concern, but her eyes were cold and calculating. This was a preemptive strike. Richard knew I might still try to attend the meeting even after Brandon stole my laptop. He deployed his wife and his favorite daughter to intercept me before I could reach the boardroom floor. They were the first line of defense designed to break my resolve. Susan stopped a few feet away, looking at my damp hair and the dark circles under my eyes. "Delis, what on earth are you doing here?" she asked, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "You look terrible. Brandon told us your truck was broken into last night. You should be resting at home, not wandering around the corporate offices." I adjusted my grip on the heavy steel handle. "I am here to attend the board meeting," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Susan sighed, shaking her head. She took a step closer, invading my personal space, hoping to intimidate me into submission. "This is exactly what we were worried about," she whispered, adopting a low, dangerous register. "You are not thinking clearly, Dilys. You have been acting incredibly erratic lately, prowling around the mill at night, confronting your brother, making wild accusations about the company finances. We are seriously concerned about your mental health." This was my mother's primary weapon. Growing up, whenever I noticed a discrepancy or questioned a family decision, she never argued the facts. She pathologized my behavior. She weaponized my quiet nature, framing my auditory processing delay as a psychological defect. If I spoke the truth, she simply declared me unstable. It is a highly effective manipulation tactic designed to make the victim doubt their own reality. She would whisper to aunts and uncles at family gatherings, claiming I was prone to delusions. "If you continue to embarrass the family in a public setting," Susan warned, her voice tightening into a threat, "we will have no choice but to take drastic measures. We will contact the state medical board and have you involuntarily committed for a psychiatric evaluation. We are just trying to protect you from yourself." Chloe stepped out from behind our mother. She clutched her expensive designer handbag and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Her eyes were wide and filled with manufactured tears. She was playing the aggrieved victim, a role she perfected during her time in Ivy League theater productions. "Dilly, please just go home," Chloe pleaded, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. "I know you are upset about my promotion. I know it hurts that I went to Harvard and got the vice president title while you are stuck in logistics. But trying to sabotage my big week is just cruel. You are letting your jealousy consume you. You are trying to ruin the company because you are bitter. Why can you not just be happy for me for once?" I stared at my sister, listening to her spin a fictional narrative built entirely on her own inflated ego. She genuinely believed my presence was driven by petty sibling rivalry. She could not comprehend that I was holding the forensic proof of her impending federal indictment right here in my arms. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to defend my sanity against my mother's threats. Arguing with a gaslighter only feeds their delusion. I simply looked at them, processing their words as empty logistical noise. The static was entirely absent from my brain. I saw them for exactly what they were: frightened thieves trying to lock the door before the auditor arrived. Chloe took another step forward, reaching out to grab my arm in a feigned display of sisterly affection. She wanted to physically pull me away from the elevator. Maya intercepted her immediately. My sister-in-law stepped cleanly between us, blocking Chloe's path with her shoulder. Maya did not raise her hands, but her physical presence was an immovable wall. Chloe gasped, stumbling back a few inches, her pristine suede boots slipping slightly on the polished marble. "Do not touch her," Maya instructed, her voice echoing sharply across the lobby. Susan glared at Maya, her face flushing with aristocratic rage. "This is a private family matter, Maya," Susan hissed. "Step aside. You have no business being here." Maya stood her ground, locking eyes with my mother. "She is not erratic, Susan," Maya said, delivering the words with brutal precision. "She is just finally doing the math." The elevator doors chimed behind me. The polished steel panels slid open, revealing the executive carriage. But the carriage was not empty. Richard stepped out into the lobby. He wore a dark tailored suit and a look of sheer panic. He was supposed to be upstairs, running the emergency liquidation vote, but the lobby commotion had drawn his attention. He did not come down alone. 2 large corporate security guards flanked him, wearing dark uniforms and carrying radio transmitters. Richard saw me standing near the elevator bank, holding the heavy steel lockbox. His eyes darted to the metal container, recognizing that it was not a laptop or a fragile digital drive. He realized his son had failed to neutralize the threat. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "She does not belong in this building," my father ordered, his voice booming across the reception area. "She is trespassing. Escort her off the premises immediately. Do whatever it takes to remove her." The two security guards closed the distance between us. Their heavy boots echoed against the polished marble floor. I did not step back. I shifted the weight of the steel lockbox, balancing it against my hip. The taller guard reached out his large hand, extending toward my shoulder. "Do not touch her." The command rang out across the lobby, cutting through the morning quiet. The guard froze, turning his head toward the entrance. Vance strode through the revolving glass doors. The potato farmer wore a thick canvas jacket and heavy work boots, leaving a trail of melting snow on the pristine white tiles. Harrison walked half a step behind him, carrying his leather briefcase. The sight of the Seattle corporate attorney alongside the oldest sitting board member sent a visible shockwave through my father. Richard stepped forward, holding up his hands. "Vance, you are early," Richard said, attempting to project calm authority. "We are handling a minor security issue. My daughter is trespassing and needs to be escorted out before our session begins." "She is not trespassing," Vance replied. His gravelly voice carried no warmth. "She is attending the meeting as my official guest." Richard clenched his jaw. His polished facade cracked, revealing the desperate man underneath. "This is a closed executive session, Vance. Non-shareholders are strictly prohibited from entering the boardroom. You know the protocols. We have highly sensitive financial restructuring to discuss." Harrison stepped around Vance and leveled a cold stare at my father. According to Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Martin Holdings corporate bylaws, any senior director possesses the unilateral right to invite an external consultant into a closed session. Mr. Vance is exercising that exact right. If you instruct your security personnel to remove her, you are in direct violation of the governance charter. That action would immediately invalidate any votes cast during today's proceedings. My father opened his mouth to argue, but the legal trap was set. He glanced at the lobby receptionist, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. He looked at Maya, who stood silently nearby, acting as an unblinking witness to his humiliation. Richard realized he could not win a public shouting match against a senior director and a corporate attorney. "Fine," Richard hissed. His face flushed a dark shade of crimson. "Let her sit in the back, but if she speaks out of turn, I will have her removed for disrupting official business." Richard turned on his heel and marched toward the executive elevator. The two security guards backed away, retreating to their posts. Vance gave me a brief nod. We followed my father into the steel carriage. Harrison and Maya stepped in right behind us. The doors slid shut, sealing us inside a small, quiet box. The ride up to the 40th floor took 30 seconds. No one spoke. The tension in the air was so thick it felt difficult to draw a full breath. I stared at the illuminated floor numbers tracking our ascent. I felt the comforting weight of the physical ledgers pulling down on my arms. The elevator chimed. The doors opened to reveal the executive boardroom. The space was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Boise skyline. A massive oval table carved from a single slab of dark mahogany dominated the center of the room. 12 plush leather chairs surrounded the wood. The men occupying those chairs represented the elite inner circle of Idaho commerce. They were local politicians, banking executives, and passive investors who treated their board seats as a social club. Richard paid for their country club dues and treated them to expensive dinners. In exchange, they rarely questioned his corporate strategy. They provided a rubber stamp for his reckless spending. Richard took his seat at the head of the table. He gestured sharply toward a row of small wooden chairs positioned against the back wall. "You can sit there, Delis," he ordered. "Keep your mouth shut." I ignored his directive. I walked past the designated guest seating and pulled out the large leather chair located at the exact opposite end of the mahogany table. I sat down, placing the heavy steel lockbox on the floor near my boots. Maya stood near the doorway, leaning against the wall. Harrison took a seat behind Vance. The board members exchanged confused glances. They were accustomed to seeing me in a high-visibility vest holding a logistics clipboard down at the loading docks. Seeing me seated at the executive table unsettled their routine. "Let us call this emergency session to order," Richard announced, speaking quickly to regain control of the room. "We have pressing business and a very tight window." He clicked a remote control, pointing it toward the ceiling. The automated blinds lowered, plunging the room into shadows. A bright projection screen dropped from the ceiling above his head. Richard displayed a series of colorful financial charts. The graphs showed steep downward trajectories, featuring bright red arrows pointing toward zero. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. "Gentlemen, we are facing a critical operational deficit." Richard began pacing near the screen. "The timber market is experiencing unprecedented volatility. Supply chain costs are skyrocketing. Our quarterly projections indicate we will fall into the red by the end of the fiscal year. If we do not inject immediate liquid capital into the operating budget, we will be forced to lay off 300 mill workers right before the holidays." The board members murmured in concerned agreement. They did not ask to see the raw data. They simply accepted the narrative Richard painted on the screen. "The solution is difficult but necessary," Richard continued, clicking to the next slide. "We must liquidate the non-essential land assets located on the North Ridge. I have a developer ready to purchase the parcels today. The cash infusion will stabilize our accounts and protect our workforce. I need a motion to approve the immediate sale." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a simple ballpoint pen. I rested my hand on the polished mahogany table. I pressed my thumb against the top button of the pen. Click. The sharp mechanical sound cut through the quiet room. Richard paused mid-sentence, his eyes darting down the length of the table. He glared at me. "I need a motion to approve the sale," Richard repeated, raising his voice slightly to command attention. I waited 2 seconds, then I pressed the button again. Click. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The rhythmic noise disrupted the smooth flow of the presentation. It broke the spell Richard was weaving over the room. I kept my face blank, focusing entirely on the metal tip of the pen, retracting and extending. I clicked it a third time. Click. "Stop doing that," Richard snapped, pointing the presentation remote at me. "This is a formal business proceeding." I set the pen down on the table. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Richard adjusted his collar, visibly sweating under the projection light. The seamless narrative he practiced in the mirror was falling apart under the weight of a tiny plastic spring. He realized he needed to close the deal before the atmosphere shifted any further. "We do not have time for a lengthy debate," Richard said, his voice climbing an octave. "The developer is waiting for our signatures. I call for an immediate vote. All those in favor of liquidating the Northridge Trust, raise your hands." A few men around the table began to lift their arms, ready to authorize the destruction of Silas Legacy. I reached down and grabbed the handle of the steel lockbox. I stood up, kicking my heavy leather chair backward. I hoisted the 30-pound container into the air and dropped it directly onto the center of the mahogany table. The metal hit the expensive wood with a deafening crash. The sound echoed off the glass windows, vibrating through the floorboards. Several board members jumped in their seats. Richard flinched, dropping his presentation remote. "Before we vote on a fictional deficit," I stated, keeping my voice cold and loud enough to reach every corner of the room, "we need to discuss where the $2.5 million actually went." The heavy steel lockbox sat on the polished mahogany surface like a bomb waiting to detonate. The sudden impact rattled the crystal water glasses placed around the oval table. I reached forward and unlocked the metal latch. The mechanism snapped open, echoing across the silent boardroom. I did not rush the process. Panic is the enemy of a successful audit. I reached inside the cold container and withdrew 12 thick manila folders. I did not toss them across the table or slide them with unnecessary force. I walked around the perimeter of the room, handing one physical dossier to each sitting director. Vance took his copy first, opening the cover, before I even returned to my seat at the far end of the room. The physical weight of the printed paper commanded immediate respect. Digital files can be manipulated or deleted by a panicked executive, but ink pressed into paper carries a permanence that cannot be ignored. My father stood near the front of the room, projecting his fictional deficit charts onto the large white screen. The glowing red arrows painted a false narrative of impending bankruptcy, designed to scare the directors into compliance. "Turn the projector off," I commanded, keeping my tone entirely devoid of emotion. A junior executive seated near the wall scrambled to hit the switch. The bright image vanished, plunging the front of the room back into the natural morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Boise skyline loomed behind my father, framing his sudden isolation. "Open your folders to page 1, I instructed the men. "Look at the first column of figures. Those are the quarterly purchase orders for our logging fleet. Note the specific machine identification numbers tied to the John Deere Feller Bunchers and Caterpillar Skidders. Now cross-reference those digits with the second page. That document is our active GPS tracking registry. The heavy machinery listed on the lease agreements does not exist in the physical world. We are paying $100,000 monthly fees to a Delaware holding company for phantom equipment." The directors flipped the heavy pages. The rustling of paper replaced the nervous silence that had previously gripped the room. Men who usually rubber-stamped my father financial requests were suddenly confronted with raw, undeniable math. They traced the columns with their index fingers, reading the fraudulent purchase orders. The pattern was glaringly obvious once the data was organized correctly. "Now turn to section 3, I said, allowing them a moment to digest the initial discrepancy. I mapped the routing numbers out of the Delaware shell accounts. I provided the corresponding wire transfer receipts originating directly from our corporate operating budget. The final destination for those stolen funds is a real estate development group based in Sun Valley. $2.5 million bled out of our local mill to fund the construction of a luxury $17 million mountain estate and purchase a high-end electric vehicle." The revelation landed with the heavy thud of a falling timber pine. The men stared at the offshore wire receipts, realizing they were looking at documented evidence of grand corporate theft. Brandon stood up from his leather chair near the front of the room. My older brother's face was twisted in sheer panic. He slammed his fists against the mahogany wood, trying to shatter the intense focus of the room. "Stop listening to her," Brandon shouted, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "She is a dyslexic failure. She cannot even read a standard logistics manifest without getting confused. She is misinterpreting routine depreciation schedules. You all know she has severe processing issues. She does not understand how executive financing operates." I did not raise my voice to match his frantic outburst. Volume is the desperate refuge of the guilty. I looked at my brother, evaluating his crumbling facade with clinical precision. "Turn to the final section of your dossiers," I told the board, ignoring his insults entirely. "The paper trail is immutable. Brandon personally authorized the fake maintenance logs to cover the missing fleet. His digital signature is stamped on every single phantom work order, proving he provided the logistical cover story required to fool the accountants." But the most revealing document sits on the very last page. The board members turned to the final sheet of paper. It was the printed digital metadata from the forged shareholder dissolution agreement. My father authored a fake legal document on his personal computer, attempting to erase my minority standing, I explained. He drafted that forgery on the exact same morning he wired the final escrow payment for the Sun Valley mansion. He needed me eliminated from the corporate structure before I could initiate an internal audit regarding that specific real estate purchase. The creation timestamps align perfectly with the offshore banking receipts. The crimes are permanently tethered together by a single string of routing numbers. Susan stood near the back wall, wearing her designer cashmere coat. Chloe hovered right beside her, clutching her expensive handbag. They had followed the security detail upstairs, hoping to witness my public humiliation. Instead, their aristocratic masks were melting off their faces. The reality of their impending ruin was setting in. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The woman who spent 29 years labeling me as the slow and defective child was now staring at me with profound terror. "You were right, Mom," I said, letting the words hit her like physical blows. Managing the clipboard out at the mill gave me full, unrestricted access to the entire inventory. I counted every single missing dollar. The local politicians and banking executives sitting around the table grew visibly pale. These were men who tolerated minor corporate excesses and lavish expense accounts as a cost of doing business. But systemic wire fraud and multi-million-dollar embezzlement were felonies that carried heavy federal prison sentences. They realized their own professional reputations were tethered to a sinking ship. The horror registered on their faces as they looked away from the folders and stared at my father. They saw him for exactly what he was. He was a desperate thief who stole from his own family legacy to fund his vanity. Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned stark white against his dark tailored suit. The grand narrative he practiced in the mirror was destroyed. The loyal allies he bought with expensive dinners and country club memberships were turning against him. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project dominance over a room that no longer respected him. He was a cornered animal, lashing out blindly at the walls closing in around him. "It does not matter," Richard declared, his voice cracking under the intense strain. He pounded his fist on the table, demanding their obedience. "None of this matters. I am the chief executive officer. I am the majority shareholder of Martin Holdings. You all work at my discretion. I am firing this entire board effective immediately. You are all dismissed." Harrison walked out from the shadows near the doorway. The Seattle corporate attorney stepped into the center of the room, moving with calculated precision. He unlatched his leather briefcase. The brass hinges clicked sharply, cutting through my father, frantic shouting. Harrison reached inside the dark interior. He pulled out the thick parchment envelope secured with my grandfather's dark red wax seal. Harrison held the cream parchment in front of the stunned executives. The red wax crumbled under his thumb, falling onto the dark wood surface. The crisp sound of breaking seals seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the executive suite. He unfolded the thick legal document, smoothing the creases with calm precision. He did not ask for permission to speak or wait for an invitation. He simply assumed command of the floor. My father watched the Seattle attorney with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to form a coherent sentence. The men seated around the oval table shifted in their chairs, sensing the impending collapse of the regime they had supported for years. For the official corporate record, Harrison began, his baritone voice carrying a clinical weight. "I present the finalized last will and testament of Silas Martin, executed and notarized 3 weeks prior to his passing." The local politicians and banking directors leaned forward, resting their elbows on the polished mahogany. Harrison read the binding clauses aloud, translating the dense jurisprudence into plain, devastating English. The decree explicitly revoked any prior succession plans filed with the state. It voided my father assumed executive authority over the enterprise. The language was bulletproof, leaving zero room for interpretation or legal maneuvering. Every sentence tightened the noose around Richard's neck. To my granddaughter Dilys, Martin Harrison read, his gaze sweeping across the paralyzed room, "I bequeath a majority, 51%, controlling stake in Martin Holdings. She is hereby granted full voting rights over all subsidiary assets, including the timber mill, the commercial real estate portfolio, and the liquid operating accounts." Richard lunged forward, knocking his crystal water glass over. The liquid spilled across the table, soaking into his printed financial charts. His polished veneer shattered, entirely replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered predator. He slammed both hands flat against the wood, sending a shockwave through the room. "That is a forgery," Richard bellowed, saliva flying from his lips, painting a portrait of desperate panic. "My father left everything to me." We all saw the original estate transition documents processed by the county clerk. Silas was 89 years old. His mind was deteriorating rapidly. He suffered from severe dementia during his final months, unable to recognize his own family members. Even if he signed that piece of garbage, he lacked the legal capacity to authorize a multi-million-dollar asset transfer. Any judge in Idaho will throw that fake document out of court before the ink dries. He looked around the oval space, begging his former allies to support his desperate narrative. But the directors remained silent, staring down at the forensic dossiers sitting in front of them. Their loyalty evaporated the moment they saw the offshore wire receipts proving his guilt. Harrison did not flinch or raise his voice. He reached back into his leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary file folder. He extracted a stack of paper-clipped forms bearing official medical seals from the state health department. Anticipating this exact defense, Harrison countered smoothly. Silas submitted to a comprehensive cognitive evaluation 48 hours before executing this testament. I have sworn affidavits from 3 independent neurologists affiliated with the Boise Medical Center. They administered extensive psychological exams. They unanimously certified his mental acuity. He possessed perfect clarity and full legal capacity, preventing any future claims of incompetence. Richard opened his mouth to argue further, but Harrison was not finished dismantling the patriarch. The attorney walked over to the digital control panel mounted on the wall near the window. He connected a small external drive to the projection system, linking it directly to the overhead display. Furthermore, Harrison added, pressing a button on the console, my client insisted on leaving a personal addendum to ensure his final wishes were never misrepresented by those seeking to profit from his demise. The white screen dropped from the ceiling once again, covering the city skyline. The fake financial charts vanished, replaced by a grainy video recording. The image quality was raw, unedited footage, but the subject was unmistakable. Silas Martin sat in his favorite worn leather armchair, wearing his signature flannel shirt. He looked frail, physically diminished by age and illness, but his eyes burned with fierce, unrelenting intelligence. The boardroom held its collective breath. Seeing the legendary founder speak from beyond the grave felt like witnessing an apparition summoned to deliver judgment. If you are watching this, Silas rasped through the speakers, his voice echoing in the sterile modern tower. It means Richard tried to steal what I built. My son measures success by the price tag on his suit and the fear he instills in his employees. He is a greedy, hollow man who treats this community like a personal piggy bank meant to fund his vanity. I watched him groom Brandon to follow the same corrupt path, ignoring the virtues of honest labor. They are builders of nothing and takers of everything, leaving only ruin in their wake. My grandfather paused, coughing into a handkerchief before looking directly into the camera lens, bridging the gap between the past and the present. But I also watched Dilys Silas continued his tone softening, with quiet, immense pride. They called her slow because she did not waste her breath participating in their loud, empty arguments. They confused her silence with ignorance, mistaking her patience for weakness. They never realized she was the only one paying attention to the foundation holding the pieces together. Dilys possesses the vision required to protect this land and the people who rely on it. The company belongs to her, and I trust her to guard it well. The video feed cut to black. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on the guilty parties. I turned my attention toward the back of the room, observing the fallout. Chloe stood frozen next to our mother, her perfect posture ruined. The manufactured tears were gone, replaced by a profound, creeping horror. My sister built her entire identity on being the golden child, the Harvard graduate destined to rule the rural empire. She had mocked my small A-frame cabin, predicting my eviction while boasting about her luxurious lifestyle. Now her brain finally processed the structural reality of the corporate hierarchy. Martin Holdings served as the primary umbrella corporation governing all related entities. That overarching umbrella held the legal titles to every single subsidiary asset, preventing personal taxation liabilities. Ridgeview, the extravagant $17 million mountain estate, was not purchased using personal funds. Richard utilized corporate accounts to bypass luxury tax penalties, resulting in the property deed remaining permanently under the company ledger. Chloe's eyes darted from the blank projector screen to my face. Her jaw trembled as the catastrophic truth settled deep into her bones. She did not own the sprawling mansion she bragged about at the gala. She did not own the high-end electric vehicle parked in the heated garage. She was merely a guest, living inside an asset controlled by the holding company. And I owned 51% of that holding company. I controlled the deed. I held the keys. My sister realized she was effectively a tenant living entirely at the mercy of the sibling she had tormented for decades. The power dynamic did not just shift favoring me slightly. It inverted, crushing her under its staggering weight. My mother swayed on her feet, gripping the edge of a nearby chair to steady her trembling frame. Susan spent 29 years enabling a thief because he provided her with country club prestige and social dominance. Now her husband was exposed as an embezzler, facing federal charges, and her favorite daughter was essentially homeless. The aristocratic shield she wielded against the world dissolved into worthless dust. Brandon slumped in his leather seat, burying his face in his hands, unable to look anyone in the eye. He knew the internal emails proving his complicity in the dummy equipment leases guaranteed his professional ruin. Richard remained standing at the head of the mahogany structure, but his posture was broken. He looked like a deflated balloon stripped of the arrogance that defined his entire existence. He stared at the blank projector screen, unable to accept his sudden irrelevance in the empire he thought he conquered. I pushed my chair back and stood up, facing the defeated men. The physical strain in my forearms was gone, replaced by a surging, calm adrenaline. I did not need to shout to gain their attention. I did not need to pound my fists against the wood to command respect. I held the ledger, and the ledger was undeniable truth. I looked around the oval space, meeting the eyes of the 12 directors. They sat in stunned silence, waiting for my instruction, acknowledging the new reality. The transition of authority was complete and absolute. As the legally established majority shareholder of Martin Holdings, I stated my voice cutting crisp and clear through the stagnant boardroom air. I am exercising my executive authority. I hereby invoke my right to call for an immediate vote of no confidence against Chief Executive Officer Richard Martin and Vice President of Logistics Brandon Martin. The silence following my motion hung in the air like thick smoke. Vance raised his hand first. His weathered arm shot up without a fraction of hesitation, casting his vote for immediate removal. The man sitting next to him, a prominent Boise banker, slowly raised his hand. One by one, the remaining directors lifted their arms. 12 hands suspended in the air. A unanimous consensus. The motion carried. Richard and Brandon were officially stripped of their executive titles. The loud, arrogant men who had dominated every Thanksgiving dinner and boardroom meeting were suddenly rendered mute. Brandon stared at the dark mahogany grain as if trying to decipher a foreign language. His carefully constructed identity as the corporate heir dissolved into stark nothingness. Richard remained frozen in his oversized chair. He looked at the raised hands surrounding him, unable to process the total evaporation of his authority. He had built his empire on intimidation, but intimidation requires a vulnerable target. I was no longer vulnerable. The sterile quiet was shattered by a sharp, piercing shriek. Chloe stomped her suede boot against the marble floor. Her face, previously a mask of Ivy League sophistication, twisted into an ugly, childish grimace. She pointed a trembling finger at the seated directors, screaming that they had no right to steal her future. She demanded someone call the local police. Watching a grown woman, a Harvard-educated lawyer, throw a toddler-level tantrum in a corporate executive suite was a surreal experience. She lacked the emotional resilience required to face real adversity. Her entire life was a padded sequence of unearned victories funded by stolen capital. Stripped of her unearned wealth, she possessed no actual substance. She turned toward our mother, pulling frantically at Susan's designer cashmere sleeve. "Fix this, Mom," Chloe wailed, her voice breaking under the weight of sheer entitlement. "Tell them they cannot take my house. Make her stop. It is my mansion. Dad promised me." She continued to sob, stamping her feet, demanding a reversal of reality. Tears ruined her pristine makeup, leaving dark streaks down her flushed cheeks. Susan yanked her arm away from her favorite daughter. The older woman realized screaming would not save their sinking ship. My mother possessed a feral survival instinct. She understood the power dynamic had inverted. She took a step toward me, offering a fragile, trembling smile. The same woman who threatened to have me involuntarily committed 30 minutes ago now tried to project a warm, maternal glow. Dilla's sweetheart Susan pleaded, keeping her tone soft and placating. Let us all take a deep breath. There is no need to tear everything apart. We can handle this internally. We are family, after all. Families fight, but they forgive each other. You have proven your point beautifully. You are brilliant, just like your grandfather always said. Now let us compromise. You do not want to ruin your father's legacy. I looked at the woman who birthed me, evaluating her desperate manipulation. I did not feel any lingering desire for her approval. The deep childhood wound that craved her affection was fully healed, closed by the cold logic of the ledger. I did not raise my voice to match Chloe hysteria. I did not gloat over their destruction. I maintained a clinical, professional posture, holding my ground. You do not get to invoke family only when you are cornered, Mom, I stated, delivering the words with stark finality. You spent 29 years treating me like a defective burden. You allowed these men to steal millions from the company while you wore designer clothes and mocked my salary. Generosity is not a debt you get to collect forever. The account is closed. A movement near the doorway shifted the focus of the room. Maya stepped forward, holding a crisp, white envelope. The sharp click of her heels echoed clearly across the floorboards. She walked around the oval table, navigating past the stunned directors. She stopped directly behind Brandon's chair. My brother looked up at his wife, hoping for a lifeline. He expected her to defend him against the sudden collapse of his world. Maya looked down at the man she married. Her dark eyes held zero sympathy. She dropped the envelope onto the table, right on top of his printed forensic dossier. These are formally executed divorce papers, Maya announced. I signed them this morning. My attorney will contact your legal counsel, assuming you can still afford one. Brandon flinched, as if she had struck him. He reached for the envelope, but his hands shook too much to grasp the paper. Maya did not linger to watch him fall apart. She turned her back on her soon-to-be ex-husband and walked purposefully toward my end of the table. She took a position standing directly behind my right shoulder, forming a united front. The brilliant Chicago architect chose the victorious side, aligning herself with the new holding company majority. The boardroom transitioned into a space of profound defeat for the former ruling class. Susan wept quietly, covering her face with her hands. Chloe sat on the floor near the wall, hugging her knees, ruining her expensive dress. Brandon stared blankly at his legal documents. The only antagonist left fighting was Richard. My father gripped the armrests of the oversized leather chair positioned at the head of the mahogany table. His knuckles were pale tight against the dark upholstery. The delusion running through his veins refused to surrender. He glared at me, his eyes burning with toxic defiance. I am not leaving this seat, Richard snarled, baring his teeth like a wounded animal. You think a piece of paper and a video from a dead man changes who I am? I built the modern infrastructure of this enterprise. This office is my birthright. I am Richard Martin, and I will not be replaced by a defective little girl. You will have to drag me out of this building. I studied his desperate final stance. He believed volume and stubbornness could override legal reality. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I did not waste another breath trying to explain the math to a man incapable of understanding his own ruin. I unlocked the glowing screen and pressed a single, pre-programmed contact number, holding the device up to my ear. The digital display on my cellular phone illuminated the sterile boardroom, the device pressed against my ear, emitting a rhythmic ringing tone. Every person seated around the oval table watched me in breathless anticipation. Richard remained frozen in his oversized leather chair, his knuckles turning bone white against the armrests. He waited for me to blink. He assumed I was bluffing, relying on the old family dynamic where I always back down to keep the peace. The line connected. A crisp, professional voice answered on the other end, identifying the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "My name is Dilys Martin," I said, speaking clearly into the receiver, ensuring my words carried across the silent room. I am the majority shareholder of Martin Holdings. I possess documented physical evidence detailing a substantial wire fraud and embezzlement scheme involving corporate executives. The stolen assets exceed $2 million. Richard flinched. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale hue. He realized the bluff was non-existent. I was turning the lock on his prison cell. I need to finalize an internal termination protocol, I told the federal agent, keeping my gaze locked on my father. Please place this call on a brief hold. I will return in 60 seconds to provide the offshore routing numbers. I pulled the phone away from my ear, but I did not sever the connection. I placed the device face up on the polished mahogany wood. The active call timer glowed brightly, ticking upward, second by second. I looked at the broken man sitting at the head of the table. You have a choice to make right now, I informed him. The terms are non-negotiable, and they expire the moment that digital timer reaches 1 minute. Harrison stepped forward, anticipating the logistical requirements of my ultimatum. The Seattle attorney reached into his leather briefcase and produced a fresh stack of legal paperwork. He slid the crisp white documents across the smooth wood, stopping them inches away from Richard's trembling hands. If I pick up that phone and read those routing numbers to the agent, you will spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary, I explained, outlining the harsh geometry of his future. The government will seize your bank accounts. They will freeze your assets. You will lose everything you stole, and you will lose your freedom. I paused, letting the weight of the impending prosecution settle over the former chief executive. However, I continued maintaining a clinical detachment. I am willing to offer an alternative. You will sign those documents Harrison just provided. They dictate the immediate and unconditional surrender of your remaining minority shares in this enterprise. You and Brandon will vacate this executive floor today, leaving your corporate access badges on this table. Furthermore, you have 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate the Ridgeview estate. Susan let out a strangled gasp. 30 days, she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. Where are we supposed to go? I turned my attention to my mother. You will live on a fixed monthly stipend, I replied. The holding company will issue a modest allowance sufficient to cover basic housing and groceries in a standard suburban neighborhood. It is far more generosity than you showed me when you paid me a poverty wage and threatened to pave over my cabin. You will survive, but you will never wield financial power over another human being again. The active call timer on my phone reached 40 seconds. Sign the papers, I commanded, looking back at Richard, or I take the phone off mute. My father stared at the glowing screen. For his entire adult life, he crushed local competitors using aggressive litigation and ruthless intimidation tactics. He always held the upper hand, leveraging his immense wealth to force weaker men into submission. Now he found himself sitting on the opposite side of the executioner block. He looked up slowly, raising his eyes to meet mine. The arrogant disdain he harbored for me over the past 29 years vanished entirely. It was replaced by something profound and primal: terror. He finally saw the sniper hidden in the tree line. He realized my quiet processing delay was never a measure of my intelligence. It was a measure of my patience. He was looking at a daughter who calculated his destruction down to the exact second, and he possessed zero leverage to stop her. The timer hit 50 seconds. Richard's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped the expensive instrument and pressed the ink against the signature line. He did not bother reading the fine print. He dragged his pen across the thick paper, signing away his shares, his authority, and his legacy. Brandon scrambled out of his seat, grabbing a spare pen from the center console. My brother signed his respective surrender forms, weeping silent tears of sheer humiliation. I picked up the cellular phone, deactivated the mute function, and informed the federal agent that the internal discrepancy was successfully resolved without the need for an official criminal inquiry. I terminated the call and slipped the device back into my coat pocket. The immediate threat of federal prison vanished, but the crushing reality of their new poverty remained. Chloe stood near the back wall, watching her father sign away their wealth. Her survival instinct finally activated, pushing her toward the exit. She slung her designer handbag over her shoulder, clutching her expensive leather coat. "I am leaving," Chloe announced, her voice trembling with residual hysteria. "I cannot stay in this room with you people." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black key fob adorned with a silver logo. She took a step toward the heavy double doors, intending to drive away in her luxury electric vehicle and pretend the morning never happened. "Leave the keys on the table, Chloe," I said, stopping her dead in her tracks. My sister turned around, clutching the fob tightly against her chest. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Dad gave this to me. It was a graduation present." I shook my head, correcting her flawed accounting. Richard utilized the Delaware shell accounts to purchase that vehicle. The money belonged to the corporate operating budget. Therefore, the Tesla is registered as a company fleet vehicle. Since you hold no official employment status within Martin Holdings, you possess no authorization to operate company property. Chloe stared at me, her jaw dropping in disbelief. "How am I supposed to get down the mountain?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "How am I supposed to get home?" "You can request a ride-sharing service," I suggested, pointing toward the mahogany surface. "Put the keys down." She looked at our father, begging him to intervene. Richard sat slumped in his oversized chair, staring blankly at his surrendered shares. He offered her no protection. Chloe slowly walked toward the table. Her pristine suede boots dragged against the marble floor. She placed the black key fob next to the physical ledgers. The soft plastic click echoed, symbolizing the final severance of her unearned status. She was a Harvard graduate with zero practical skills, standing in a corporate tower with no transportation and an impending eviction notice. I looked toward the front entrance of the boardroom. The two large security guards who previously threatened to physically throw me out of the building were watching the entire exchange. Their loyalties always belonged to the signature signing their payroll checks. They recognized the tectonic shift in authority. "Escort these former employees out of the facility," I instructed the guards, gesturing toward my family members. "Ensure they collect only personal items from their offices. They are permanently barred from entering any property owned by this enterprise." The guards stepped forward, moving with crisp, professional efficiency. They flanked Richard, pulling his chair back. My father stood up, moving like a hollow shell. He did not look at me again. He walked toward the exit, dragging his feet. Susan followed him, her aristocratic posture broken, her designer coat offering no warmth against the cold reality of her future. Brandon and Chloe trailed behind them, a pathetic procession of displaced royalty. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing the corridor. The 12 corporate directors remained seated around the oval structure, waiting for my next directive. Maya stepped away from the wall, walking over to collect the signed surrender documents. Vance leaned back in his chair, offering a quiet, approving nod. The transition was flawless. I walked around the perimeter of the room, moving past the empty chairs. I approached the head of the table, where my father had ruled with fear and volume for 3 years. I placed my hands on the high leather back and pulled the seat out. I sat down, resting my palms flat against the cool, polished wood. The ambient noise of the city hummed beyond the thick glass windows, but inside the executive suite, the atmosphere was perfectly still. I closed my eyes and listened. The static was gone. The chaos was eradicated. The silence, finally, belonged to me. 6 months later, the harsh Idaho winter gave way to a vibrant emerald spring. The snowpack melted off the Bitterroot Range, feeding the rivers and breathing life back into the deep valleys. I sat on the front porch of my wooden A-frame cabin, holding a ceramic mug of dark coffee. The morning air smelled of damp earth and fresh pine needles. The quiet surrounding me was no longer a forced isolation. It was a choice. The transition of power within Martin Holdings generated a brief wave of local gossip, but corporate scandals fade quickly when the new leadership focuses on stability. I did not move into a glass corner office. I did not purchase a luxury vehicle or a penthouse suite. I kept my beat-up Ford truck, and I stayed in the home I built with my own hands. I prefer the structural integrity of reclaimed timber over the cold aesthetic of polished steel. We restructured the enterprise from the ground up. The company operates under a new charter, balancing profitability with ecological preservation. We maintain the commercial logging operations, prioritizing selective harvesting instead of destructive clear-cutting. The North Ridge remains untouched, permanently protected by a reinforced conservation trust that no future executive can ever dissolve. Silas loved this wilderness, and I ensured his original vision survived the greed that tried to consume it. The $17 million mountain estate known as Ridgeview no longer belongs to the corporate ledger. We placed the property on the open market and sold it to a technology executive relocating from California. I did not absorb the revenue into the operating budget. I diverted the entire sum into an environmental grant program funding watershed restoration and wildlife protection across northern Idaho. The monument to my father's vanity now serves the exact land he intended to destroy. I do not manage the daily corporate logistics alone. I promoted Maya to the position of Chief Operating Officer. The brilliant architect from Chicago finally occupies a role that matches her formidable intellect. She runs the Boise headquarters with a fierce, unmatched efficiency. When she walks into the executive boardroom, the directors listen. She dictates policy, structures the operational budgets, and commands genuine respect without ever needing to raise her voice. She shed the toxic weight of her previous marriage and emerged as a powerhouse executive. We talk every morning before the markets open, sharing a mutual understanding built in the trenches of that family war. The people who waged that war are currently experiencing the harsh reality of the consequences they earned. Richard and Susan reside in a two-bedroom condominium located in a dense commercial sector of Boise. The property is structurally sound, but it lacks the sprawling, manicured lawns and gated security they once considered a basic human right. Their monthly stipend covers their utility bills and modest groceries, leaving zero room for luxury expenditures. They can no longer afford their prestigious country club memberships. The local politicians and wealthy developers who used to attend their lavish dinners stopped returning their calls the day the board fired my father. The elite circles of Idaho commerce possess zero tolerance for disgraced executives who lose their grip on power. My parents spend their days sitting in a cramped living room, surrounded by the deafening silence of a ringing telephone that nobody ever answers. They are isolated, forced to endure each other's company without the buffer of unearned wealth. My older brother Brandon is discovering that forensic accounting extends far beyond corporate boardrooms. When we terminated his employment, we handed his digital records over to an independent auditing firm to finalize his severance. The independent auditors flagged multiple discrepancies linking his personal income to the dummy equipment leases. Those red flags triggered an official inquiry by the Internal Revenue Service. Brandon currently spends his waking hours sitting in a small rented apartment buried under mountains of federal tax forms. The government is meticulously dismantling 7 years of his personal filings, demanding receipts he cannot provide. The man who loved to micromanage his employees using surveillance software is now trapped under the microscope of federal investigators. Chloe experienced the most abrupt descent into reality. Stripped of her corporate title, her luxury vehicle, and her mountain estate, my sister was forced to navigate the actual job market. Her Harvard law degree looks impressive on a resume, but corporate law firms conduct rigorous background checks. The whispers regarding her direct complicity in our father embezzlement scheme rendered her radioactive in the legal community. No reputable firm wanted to risk their reputation by hiring a disgraced heiress. Her luxury credit cards accumulated astronomical balances during her brief tenure as the golden child. With no corporate accounts to pay her debts, she faced severe collections. Chloe currently works an entry-level retail position at a high-end boutique in downtown Boise. The woman who once stood on a stage expecting to inherit an empire now spends 8 hours a day standing on her feet, folding cashmere sweaters, and serving the exact same wealthy socialites she used to view as her peers. She rides the city bus wearing comfortable orthopedic shoes, learning the stark mathematical truth of minimum wage. I take a slow sip of my coffee, watching a red-tailed hawk circle above the tree line. The static in my brain remains permanently silenced. When I look out over the vast expanse of the Martin timberland, I do not see a kingdom I conquered. I see a ledger that finally achieved perfect equilibrium. For 29 years, I allowed loud, arrogant people to dictate my value. I believed my processing delay made me defective because the people supposed to protect me utilized my quiet nature as a weapon against me. I shrank into the shadows, avoiding conflict, hoping my silent compliance would eventually earn their respect. I learned the hard way that toxic individuals never respect compliance. They only respect leverage. If you are listening to this and you recognize your own reflection in my story, I need you to understand a fundamental truth. You might be the family scapegoat. You might be the quiet one sitting at the back of the room doing the heavy lifting while the loud voices claim all the credit. You might feel suffocated by the expectations of people who only value you when you are useful to their specific agenda. They will call you slow. They will call you dramatic. They will label you difficult the moment you stop absorbing their cruelty. Do not let their manufactured narrative rewrite your reality. You do not need to scream to prove you are strong. You do not need to throw a tantrum to establish your boundaries. Anger is a fleeting biological response, but calculated justice is a permanent architectural structure. You possess a unique vision. Your ability to endure their noise means you can spot the patterns they are too arrogant to notice. Gather your evidence. Build your physical ledgers in the dark. Protect your assets and prepare your strategy with cold, unwavering precision. When the time comes, you will not need to beg for your seat at the table. You will simply present the undeniable truth and watch their hollow empire collapse under its own weight. True power never needs to shout to clear a room. It just needs to know its own worth and do the math. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of your own journey in these words, drop a comment below and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Stay quiet, stay sharp, and always keep your receipts. I will see you in the next one.